So we've talked about civil rights and equal treatment under the law, under the 14th Amendment. And now we're going to look at one of the most important civil rights is your right to vote and how that can be infringed on and how that has been infringed on. And this is still a controversy today. People talk about whenever we try to take power away from certain groups voting to empower other groups, that could benefit certain groups. And that's really important because that can result in the outcome of elections and give certain groups more power in the legislative branch or for the president with the electoral college and other groups. That's why it's so important under civil rights theory that you would treat everybody equal in representation when talking about voting. Well, one way in the South in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, actually as soon as African American men could vote in the 1865, states would discriminate against people of color voting. And one way that they would do this, especially in Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana and Georgia in the deep southern states, is they would create what's called a literacy test. So let's look at a literacy test. This is a test you had to take to vote. Now, there's nothing in the Constitution about taking a test to vote. There was initial intention, though, that it would only be for white males that own property. So there was some restrictions, but they did not have to take literacy tests, even in 1788 and 17 when the Constitution was actually ratified. Now, if a person, this is the questions. If a person is charged and denies his guilt, how many persons must testify against him before he can be convicted? 2. Now, that's not even on our end of course exams or our citizenship test or state tests. It's not that important. It's a very specific question. And also, how does this test your literacy, which is your ability to read? Second question. At the time of day of January 20th, each 4 years, does the term of the President of the United States end? It's noon. Now, I know that as a government teacher and history teacher, I don't think the average person knows that it's officially noon when it's over. If a president does not wish to sign a bill, how many days is he allowed Congress to reconsider? 10 days. He has 10 days or it dies in what's called a pocket veto. Now, that's interesting, but I don't know if that's necessary for you to know that to actually vote for president or congressmen or women or your state representatives. And this is a really interesting one. If a bill is passed by Congress and the president refuses to sign it and does not send it back to Congress in a session within the specific period of time, is the bill defeated or does it become law? It becomes law unless Congress adjourns before the expiration of 10 days. So, this is interesting, and some of the information is probably not that important at all. It's very specific, and this would be easy answers you could give your friends. So you could see this is one I believe is from Mississippi, and this was to keep especially African Americans out of the voting booths so that whites could have control over the vote in Alabama, Mississippi, and the Deep South. And it worked. It worked. It worked very well. Now, another way they would discourage or stop African Americans from voting was they made it almost impossible to register to vote. And how would you register to vote? Well, first of all, in the South, you would have to go down to the courthouse, which was only open on certain days a week during work hours, and to get in there. Well, most African Americans didn't have a lot of money, and they probably worked all day. And you better believe that a lot of bosses that were white, in order to discriminate, they would actually make sure they worked on days where you could actually register to vote. Now, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 changes the game. Really important. We talked about the Civil Rights Act, which is the law that you could use to say you want equal treatment under the law based on race, gender, creed, or religion. This one is to make sure you can actually vote. And what it does is it made sure that everyone's right to vote, regardless of skin color, religion, was protected by the government, outlawed poll taxes and literacy tests. So it got rid of literacy tests and the poll tax, and they went one step further. They're going to actually amend the Constitution to get rid of poll taxes, to say that you can't use any kind of poll tax. And this is a very famous picture. I love that picture on the bottom right about how you can just see these young men are so dedicated to the idea of voting. They want this constitutional right. And a lot of times, people have sacrificed their lives. They've been in prison, like Susan B. Anthony, or many women leaders, Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks. You think of all these famous civil rights leaders men and women over the centuries that have fought so hard, and many have died. So we have the right to vote, and in practice, many people have fought for this country, so we have the right to vote. So it's a very sacred idea that we have democracy, a republic, where we can actually vote for people to represent us. That isn't given in all nations. So 1965 changes the United States. It really starts getting rid of things like literacy tests and polling taxes, which was this idea that you had to pay money under a poll tax to vote. Well, that's to keep people who are poor out of voting, because that's not a big deal if you have money. But that would discourage people that don't have money to vote, and that we have these questions still today. Like in some states, including Missouri, that they're really pushing for this idea that you have to have an ID, a driver's license or a state ID to vote. Well, in the Constitution, again, it says nothing about an ID to vote. There's no mention of it, and it's interesting that because right now you could use your residence as proof that you could vote. So you could use official bills like your gas bill or your water bill to show that where you live, so that you don't commit voter fraud, and they can check on that. But not everybody does walk around with an ID, and we know that people that don't have money or can't afford a car are probably less likely to own a driver's license or a state ID, or elderly people too that might not have ever gotten an ID. It does cost money. It might cost $25 to get your ID. So who's paying for that? If they're paying for that, is that a poll tax? And that's a valid question. So I'm gonna give you a question here. Let's try this one. Southern states that create majority minority districts do so because, so a majority minority district is this idea that most people, they would concentrate people of color into an area. So for example, like District 1 in St. Louis, in North St. Louis, in North County is predominantly African American. Well, there's some benefits to majority minority districts for minorities. They almost guaranteed that they get somebody that represents them that looks like them. They've had an African American representative in District 1 for years, and they elected another African American woman, Cori Bush, beat out Lacy Clay after years and years and years of Lacy Clay in office, and his father, Bill Clay. So that can be a benefit. But on the other side of it, it could hurt Americans overall, because if you concentrate all the people of color into votes in the small areas because of segregation, that we call de facto segregation, which means that just the way people live still today, consequences from being segregated all this time, and people still living together based on their races, it causes it can actually weaken their votes and the impact of their votes overall. So we know people of color tend to vote Democrat, and if you can concentrate African Americans into one or two districts in the entire state, even though they're a bigger percentage of the population of a state, then they actually are getting less representation in the House of Representatives than they would if they could help other districts win more Democratic seats, which would maybe benefit them overall, if that's 90% of African Americans tend to vote Democrat. So those are things to think about. Well, let's look at this one. So is it A, the Supreme Court ruled in Shaw versus Reno in 1963 that they had created them in order to achieve a racial balance? B, states were attempting to follow the provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. C, states were responsible for presidential executive orders. Or D, states were following the guidelines established in Baker versus Carr in 1962. And the answer is B. States were attempting to follow the provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We just talked about that. So under that Voters' Rights Act, they were trying to give representation, and it was a good idea. It's an idea that we should give people of color representation, actually get African Americans and Latinx and Asian Americans in government by concentrating their votes into certain congressional districts. And the other case is actually Baker versus Carr is one vote, one person, very important, and understanding this. And Shaw versus Reno is the idea that you cannot discriminate based on voting. So let's keep going. And we talked about the Civil Rights Act. Now, another piece we want to talk about is we just said that the polls tax were outlawed, with literacy tests were really hit hard in the 1965. Like, you have to give everybody a chance to vote. Also, there's things like We now supervise, especially in southern states, under the Voters' Rights Act, which is going away. There's been pushing to get the southern states want it out of there. There's still supervision by the federal government of voting to make sure that people of color have a right, are actually getting to vote, and they're not being intimidated. Because remember, it's very easy for the Ku Klux Klan to stand around the corner and just stand outside the polling place and let you know that if you came to vote, what's going to happen. So they're watching you, or your boss could fire you because you went to go vote, or they could guess who's down here voting, and they give your boss a call and tell on you and say you're voting, especially in small towns in Mississippi and Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, Tennessee, Virginia. So the 24th Amendment was actually added into the Constitution as a result of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voters' Rights Act of 1965. And this eliminated the poll tax and outlawed any voting tax. So now this gets rid of the poll tax completely, and then the 65 reinforces that, the Voters' Rights Act. So now, poll taxes, any kind of payment for voting is stopped. And that really changes things. So that's the big question we're talking about: driver's license or IDs. Can they charge you money and make you get an ID to vote? Well, there's a strong argument under the 24th Amendment against the Constitution. It really specifically states you can't have a poll tax and you can't have voting. There's any kind of voting taxes. It cannot cost money for you to vote. The states have to pay for voting. They have to pay for the booths, and they have to provide you with the opportunity to vote. And they need to stay open X amount of hours so that you actually have a chance to vote. Let's look at the consequences of the Voters' Rights Act of 1965 and the 24th Amendment. The impact of Voting Rights Act in 1965 was it registered before the act. Look at this. This is right before the act. And then the blue is in 1967. Within 2 years, look at this. AL is Alabama. Alabama went from 21%. If you look at the top, it says impact of Voting Rights Act, black voter registration. And 19% in Alabama went to almost, about 50-something percent. Georgia, 24%, up to 50. Look at Louisiana. At least they had 25% African Americans voting. Now they're almost at 60. Mississippi is the biggest one. That's insane. Mississippi basically had 10%, maybe 5% African Americans voted in Mississippi to 60%. This changes the whole game. North Carolina increases. South Carolina increases. Virginia has a big jump. They go from about 38% to almost 60%. And one of the biggest consequences of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 and 24th Amendment, they're no longer charged to vote, is people got out there and vote. And that's about what white people did. Most people voted. About 60% of Americans voted at the time. So that really put African Americans on more equal ground with white people and other people of color too. Latinx, Asian Americans, they can now vote safely without paying for it, without some kind of crazy test that only that other people are given the answer.